Hi guys, welcome to Dubs Only Sports. This is going to be episode 39 now. We got the De Los Ducks jersey on. We've got the UCLA shirt on. It's time to talk about college football, guys. It's August. College football starts this month. Not necessarily for our teams. I know Oregon's first game is the 2nd of September.
Yeah, I think
So
same with us. Yeah.
I'm still a month out personally. I could care less about UCLA's schedule, to be fair. But if you live under a rock, you might not know that a lot of these college football teams, especially in the Pac-12, are up and leaving. And let me tell you, it has been a crazy, it's been going on for like a couple of years now. It
Two
kind of
years now.
started,
Yeah.
yeah,
It
it
started with
started with
Texas and
in
Oklahoma. Yeah.
Oklahoma wanting to go to the SEC. They didn't
Yeah.
do that. And then USC and UCLA were like, hey, let's go to the Big Ten. And they ended up doing that. And then the rest of the Pac-12 were like, well, what are we going to do? And then who was it?
So,
I
okay.
think
So let's go back. We'll go back to the beginning of
we'll
this
we'll
all.
give you a timeline. We'll give
We'll
you a
give you a
timeline right
timeline of
now.
this. Then
And
we'll
then
give
we'll
you
give you
some.
our reactions on it, just in
Yeah. We'll
case
give you.
you happen to miss the big college football news, which is essentially the Pac-12 is now the Pac-4, and it
Yeah.
is the most oblivious conference in all of college football history. And it will be replaced by teams like Fresno State, San Jose State, Boise State,
Dude, that shit's
UNLV,
gonna
Big
explode,
Red.
bro. The Pac-12 is destroyed. But basically, like, just do a rough timeline. Not gonna be perfectly accurate, but it's basically what happened. So a few years ago, Texas and Oklahoma decided to go to the SEC just because they wanted to be in a better football conference, more money in
What a
there. So
time.
fine, respect that. Texas and Oklahoma leave the Big 12, go to the SEC.
Yeah.
Then after UCLA and USC are like, why are we still stuck in the Pac-12? Why are we getting the same amount of money as Washington State and Oregon State? Okay, we're gonna go to the Big Ten and join up with Ohio State and Michigan and these big power
Penn
schools in
State.
college football. All these teams, yeah. So that's what happened next. Then for like a year or so, it was pretty calm, but everyone knew that kind of things they didn't know what was going to happen. Then after Cincinnati, BYU, UCF, and Houston joined the Big 12.
Yeah.
And they're all going to be in the conference this year. So this year, the UCLA and USC are still in the Pac-12. Texas and Oklahoma are still in the Big 12. But this year, those four teams that I mentioned, Cincinnati, BYU, Houston, and UCF, they're all going to be in the Big 12 as well. So the Big 12 is going to have 14 teams this year for football.
For
So
whatever
which is
reason.
crazy. But
So the
yeah,
Big 12 has
so
14 teams. The
the Big
Big
12
10
has 14
has
teams. The Big 10 has 14
16,
teams. The Big 10
14,
has
and the
14 right
Pac-12 has
now.
4.
The Pac-12 is gonna have four. Now they have 12, but yeah, it's a whole mess. Then after those four teams join the Big 12, then Colorado with Deion Sanders, they kind of started this whole wave because Deion Sanders, I can't say enough. He has done an amazing job with Colorado. This team was 1-11 last year.
And they're
1
going to
and
be
11.
1-11 this
That's
year.
exact. But the thing is, it doesn't matter because they were 1-11 last year. They were so irrelevant. And this team is like the center of national headlines, and they haven't won a game in a year, bro. It's the craziest thing to me. Deion Sanders has done a great job. I think he's going to do a great job at Colorado. He's done a great job with the branding of the team. Their spring game was full out. They got tons of 5 stars. They're building a program. Deion Sanders, love that guy. And then what he did, very smart. He got ahead of all this transferring conferences and all this stuff, this conference realignment. He got ahead on all this. He was the first team after UCLA and USC to leave the Pac-12. They decided to go to the Big 12 because they knew the Pac-12 is disintegrating. It's just gonna die. So
Yep.
we're gonna get out of it before the ship sinks. Smart job by Deion Sanders. They're in the Big 12 now. Then Oregon and Washington are like, wait, why are we still in the Pac-12? We're two of the biggest brands in the college football world. Why are we still in this dying conference? We're going to go to the Big 10 as well. So now the Big 10 is going to have Oregon, Washington, UCLA, and USC. They're going to join the Big 10. And then other good teams like Arizona, Arizona State, Utah, they're like, why are we still in the Pac-12 as well? So they're all going to the Big 12. So now the
Yep.
Big 12 is going to have Colorado, Arizona State, Arizona, and Utah. So they're going to have those four teams. And now the Pac-12 is basically four teams went to the Big 10, four teams went to the Big 12, and now the Pac-12 is left with four teams: Oregon State, Washington State, Cal, and Stanford, and they're
As they
screwed.
should.
And they're
As they
screwed.
should.
These are the four worst these are the four worst programs for sports for college English still. These these are the four worst sports programs, athletic programs for football and basketball in the Pac-12. They have good, like Stanford and Cal have relatively solid athletic programs overall, but for the main sports like baseball, football, basketball, they're struggling recently. So these four schools, they don't generate any money from their athletics just because they're not big brands, and they're
Mhm.
screwed because Washington State has got left by Washington, Oregon State got left by Oregon. Or wait, so they're all screwed. Cal and Stanford are they're together, but they're screwed as well because the craziest thing about this is that Stanford 7 years ago when they had Christian McCaffrey was a top 5 team in college football, and
Yeah.
if it was at that time, they would be the first team to go to the Big Ten.
People
And
forget
now,
that Andrew Luck played for Stanford and
yeah,
he was
Andrew Luck
pretty good
played
in
for them. They've
college.
had tons of good players at
Yeah.
Stanford. Stanford has a good football program, and
Yeah.
now recently they just sucked. So I don't know what's going to happen with them. They might still join the Big Ten. Who knows? But they might be an independent team. They might try to join like the Mountain West or just some. I honestly don't know what they're going to do. And
There are talks of Oregon State going to the Big Ten because as Oregon fans,
Oregon
we
State,
care. Yeah, we care about the Civil War way too much. So
but you could
we
just do an
still
independent
feel
game. You
like
don't even need to
we
be in the
can,
conference.
yes, we can
You could just
still do an independent game, but there are
like
talks of them
USC,
going to the
USC
Big
and
Ten
Notre
as
Dame
well.
play each other every year, even though
Yeah,
Notre Dame's an independent and they're not in the same conference. So
yeah,
the first thing that I find fascinating from this whole thing is that we have these three massive conferences now. We have the SEC, which is going to have 16 teams. We have the Big Ten, which is going to have 18 teams. And then
yeah.
we have the Big 12, which is going to have like, I think 16
15 or
teams as well,
16,
or
yeah.
a ton of teams, right? They're all going to have tons of teams. And the problem is that the ACC is going to the ACC is screwed because the ACC in football has been dying over time. They used to, in the early 2000s, they had Florida State, Miami. These were the biggest brands in college football. Now
Mhm.
Miami hasn't been relevant like in 20 years. Florida State has been on the decline for the last like 10 years. And now supposedly they're supposed to be good this year, but everyone knows that they're overrated. And
Yeah.
then Clemson had a very good stretch this decade, but recently they've kind of fallen off a little bit. So, and even if Clemson and Florida State and Miami, even if they all three were good, the rest of the conference is just terrible. So
Yeah.
the ACC in football is screwed. In basketball, they have two of the biggest brands in North Carolina and Duke, but like college basketball is not as important for the revenue. So I don't know how that's going to work. I don't know if the ACC is going to dissolve and they're going to join other conferences like the
Mhm.
SEC and the Big 10 and the Big 12. I don't know, or they're just going
Yeah.
to stay like the ACC, or they can join up with the Big East for basketball. Like who knows what's going to happen? But
Mhm.
I feel like this whole conference thing is basically as these teams start joining these massive conferences, it's eventually just going to be no conferences. Because like, what's the point of having a conference if UCLA is playing Rutgers? Like, it's not about the regional; it's all about the money. It's all about getting a deal. So eventually, if the NCAA dissolves and there's like it disappears just because it's such a corrupt institution,
Mhm.
maybe in the future we're looking at no conferences. Maybe we're just looking at every team is an independent team. There's like
Mhm.
a whole oversight. There's like one unifying oversight, and
Yep.
they all pay the teams based on the revenue share. Who knows what's going to happen? But I find that it's like that's one thing that's interesting. The other thing that's interesting is that the independent teams, Notre Dame, and then potentially Cal, Stanford. We'll see what
Mhm.
happens with Oregon State and Washington State. But I
Yeah.
wonder if teams are going to just start going independent because they're like,
There's no
what's
point.
the point? There's no point in doing the conference thing is kind of falling apart. We
Yeah.
could just be independent. We could still play like Stanford. If you look at Stanford, they could still play UCLA, USC, Oregon,
Yeah.
Washington, one or
You
two
can
of them,
still
and
schedule those
you
games for
can still
like
schedule them.
preseason.
And then
Yeah.
they could play like teams like BYU.
Those first
Um,
3 weeks are open
yeah,
to anyone. Oregon plays Portland State. So
exactly.
like
They could,
imagine if we didn't play Portland State, we played Stanford instead. Like at least that's gonna sell tickets and it might be a
yeah,
good game depending on
yeah.
whether or not Stanford's on a good year or not.
They might
But
not
it's
be a good team, but
definitely
they have a big
better.
brand. So
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. So yeah,
yeah,
and I feel like it's definitely gonna be interesting in the up and coming years, especially for these teams that aren't necessarily as good, but have had their moments throughout
yeah,
the year. And like it would be interesting for these teams to try and like earn a spot into a conference. And I'm not saying that this is like good or bad, it's just kind of like an idea, but treat it like the Premier League where you can have teams drop in and out of conferences and all that kind of stuff. But then it would
that
just
would be
be
cool.
kind of unorganized and all that kind of
Yeah,
stuff. But I feel like so going into college football, at least, there are 2 points I want to make. The first one is the rivalries that I am so excited to see. And I'll go from 3-1, right? The one that I'm excited about but doesn't have enough popularity is USC Michigan. USC Michigan isn't like necessarily like a rivalry, but just knowing the fan bases, it can be one of the biggest events every single year, whether it's at the Coliseum in LA or whether it's in Ann Arbor. It's going to be a crazy game regardless. And you look at the Rose Bowl from like 2008 or 2010 when they played each other, it was a crazy game. The second one is the holy war between BYU and Utah. The Mormons battling it out for the championship of Utah. It was touched on a little bit on Instagram, on SportsCenter, ESPN, I can't remember, but they're right. The Holy War is probably one of my favorite college football rivalries. Honestly, it's more for the jokes than it is the game itself, but BYU for college football definitely is on a come up. I mean, you look at last year, they were almost a top 10 team. If not, they may have been a top 10 team for a week. And, that game against Oregon that I watched, it was a well-fought game. BYU, they definitely have a really good program. You look at a guy like, Zach Wilson, who may not be doing anything in the NFL now, but in college, boy, oh boy, was he an athlete and a half. But that's just how it goes. And that last one, as an Oregon fan, I got to point it out. Oregon, Ohio State. We haven't met up that many times, but the times that we have met up, it has been some amazing games. You look at the regular season game Oregon had a couple of years ago in the shoe. They won that game, beat them by 20 points. You look at the 2015, the first ever college football playoff national championship. Ohio State absolutely blew us out of the water. And then we've shared a Rose Bowl game together where Ohio State also blew us out of the water. So again, the good thing about all of these transitions is that it allows for rivalries to spark up. It allows for these teams to play in different environments. I mean, you look at the kind of heat that LA has to deal with, especially in that early fall, and you look at the cold that teams like USC and UCLA will have to go through when they play teams like Michigan or Northwestern or Rutgers in the snow because it happens to be the middle of December. It's all going to be very exciting stuff. But I can't help but point out how terrible I feel for all the other sports, because let's be real, college football brings in the most revenue. And the reason why all of these switches in conference, the reason why it's happening is because of the football programs. It has nothing to do with the baseball programs, nothing to do with the basketball programs. Look at sports at swimming, water polo, lacrosse, whatever you play, golf, whatever you play in college, you're not involved in this at all. It has everything to do with the college football teams. And I can't help myself but feel bad because, yes, I'm an avid college football fan, and I love this for college football. But for the colleges themselves, it is so sad and so upsetting for a lot of these teams. And I mean, you look at basketball schools like Arizona State and like Colorado, they are not the strongest teams. And here they are walking into arguably one of the strongest basketball conferences, like the Big 12 and like the Big 10. Like it is very concerning. So for a college football standpoint, yes, great. But the thing is that it's not the football team that's switching the conference. It's the entire school that's switching their conference. So that'll also be something interesting that, we'll see as, years go on and decades go on, and see how this, kind of pans out. But having just 3 main conferences, I feel like, is probably the smartest thing that has happened in college sports in a while. And because college sports, quite frankly, hasn't changed much since it began. And so I feel like it's definitely an interesting turn of events. It really goes to show that if we want change, we can definitely achieve that. Regardless, it is on an economic scale and more for a business point of view than it is hey, let's let the guys compete. But this allows for, different recruiters and people who are committing to colleges. Obviously, if you have a team like Georgia or Alabama lined up and you're trying to decide whether or not you want to go to an SEC school instead of some crappy Pac-12 school like Washington State, even Oregon wouldn't beat Georgia or Alabama on a good day. Like, obviously, those guys 10 out of 10 times, or not 10 out of 10 times, but most of the time will choose the SEC schools, the Big 10 schools, the Big 12 schools. Pac-12 was always bottom of that list. Even the ACC got more of an up on that. But the Pac-12 last year really proved themselves and they made a name for themselves. I mean, you look at the amount of teams that not only stayed in the top 25, but were in and out of the top 25 as well. And, you've got all these transfers. I mean, you look at the quarterback from Clemson, whose name I'm going to mess up, but his first name is DJ. His last name, I still need to get
Just
on a
don't even try.
tour
Don't even
level.
try, bro. You're not gonna.
I still need to get on a tour
DJU,
level.
baby. DJU.
DJU going to Oregon State is interesting, and that could raise some questions for the future of Oregon State, and that could allow for other quarterbacks to be like, hey, like they, and if DJU does very well in the NFL, then, other quarterbacks in high school and in middle school could be like, hey, maybe I want to go to Oregon State instead. So
yeah,
it definitely raises a lot of questions, and the only way that we'll be able to answer those questions is if we go through these next few years, just testing it out, seeing what happens. Obviously they're not going to go back to the Pac-12. They're going to stay in the conference, but
the Pac-12
it'll
over.
just be
the Pac-12's not going to exist.
Yeah, it'll just be no. The Pac-12 will still exist because
it's honestly, I genuinely believe that the Pac-12 is just gonna fall apart. I just think Cal, Stanford are gonna leave. No, because people are they're gonna leave. Why are they gonna stay? There's no reason to stay.
No.
They're gonna leave.
The Pac-12. The Pac-12 is sitting on way too much money and too much popularity to just.
They don't have the whole reason that they left is that the money was terrible. The TV contracts that they were giving
for those franchises, it was terrible for them.
It was terrible. The whole structure of it was bad for the whole conference. The Pac-12 did such a terrible job marketing their brands. The Pac-12 had some of the biggest brands in the country. They had USC and UCLA. Yeah. USC is arguably the biggest college football brand on the West Coast with Oregon. Oregon and USC are the two of the top 5 biggest brands in college football, okay? Mm-hmm. Just based on, like, Oregon has the whole Nike thing. USC's been a massive brand for tons of time. In basketball, the biggest brand on the West Coast is UCLA, as everyone knows. So they did such a bad job by having games. All the games would be at 7 p.m., 8 p.m., 9 p.m. Pacific time, which is midnight, 10 p.m. to midnight on the East Coast. It was crazy. So no one on the East Coast watched any of the Pac-12 games. None of the star players in the Pac-12 ever got any recognition. All that you'd see in the bracketology in college basketball, out of the 68 teams that made the tournament, maybe 3 or 4 teams would be from the Pac-12, even though the Pac-12 was always a solid conference, and always the teams in the Pac-12 would get significantly underranked in the tournament, and all the Big Ten and SEC schools would be overranked just because no one saw the Pac-12 schools. And whenever the Pac-12 teams would lose one game at an SEC school, everyone would be like, oh my God, the Pac-12 team sucks. Instead of saying, oh yeah, maybe they have to travel 5 hours away, play one game, and they lost one game during a season. No one took that into consideration. So the Pac-12 did a terrible job marketing their teams. Now with the Pac-12 teams like UCLA, USC, Oregon, Washington, all these teams moving out of the conference and getting to play in the Big Ten, it's going to help them significantly because now UCLA, for example, let's do basketball for this to start. UCLA basketball is going to play Michigan, Ohio State, Purdue, Michigan State, all these big college basketball programs. And now no one's going to be able to say, oh, UCLA has an easy schedule because everyone has hyped up the Big Ten for years, even though they never win anything. Everyone's hyped that conference up for years. Now there's going to be no excuse to leave UCLA out of the top few lines of the tournament because even if they lose a few games, they're in the toughest conference, right? So it'll just help on that just because of the perception of the Big Ten is a massive thing. In football, it's going to be the same thing. So all these people are posting these graphics saying how the Big Ten, the current Big Ten with USC, UCLA, Oregon, and Washington has only won one national championship in football and basketball since 2007, whereas the SEC has 17 or something like that.
Yeah, but that's because we're playing crappy teams in the regular season. Yeah, and by the time we get to a point where we're playing decent teams, we'll be close. But 8 out of 10 times
we're set up for failure because
we haven't had that challenge yet.
Yeah, we're set up for failure because the SEC schools in football, for example, they have cupcake schedules. Alabama gets to play Austin and Pay the second to last game of the season before they play Auburn for the Iron Bowl. You look at Georgia, they play Southern Missouri and just all these bummy teams. And then even you look at the SEC, I think it's the SEC East, just a terrible division of football. I mean, they have Tennessee is good now, but they haven't been good for years since Peyton Manning. We have Florida, who's up and down all the time. Now they're down. We have just the most just terrible football conference. South Carolina is always mid, just no good teams at all. So Georgia just gets to stomp their way into the college football playoff every single year. They don't play anyone. And now with all these conferences, with the SEC adding Texas and Oklahoma, that's 2 tougher games for them to play every year. And they need to have there's no reason in the SEC that Georgia doesn't play Alabama. The fact that Georgia never plays Alabama in the regular season just shows that they want their teams in the college football playoff, because if those teams played in the regular season,
They
one of
want
them
them.
wouldn't make the playoff.
They
One of
want
them
they
wouldn't
want
make
them
the
to
playoff.
play in that SEC championship
Exactly.
every single year.
They want Alabama, LSU, Texas A&M, all these schools, and then Georgia to play easy schedules during the regular season, match up in the college football playoffs, so they can say, "Oh, they're both amazing teams. They're both going to go to the playoff, regardless of the result of the conference championship game, because they're both great teams. They have no losses during the regular season," which is dumb because in the Pac-12, USC has to play UCLA, Oregon, Washington, Utah, all these great teams. They're not great teams. They're all top 25 teams. They're not as good as Alabama and Georgia, but they're all really good teams. You're not going to win all those games. If
They're
you have
better. They're
six.
better than most of the SEC teams. Let's be
Exactly.
real.
Like this year in college football, the best conference, the deepest conference based on just top tier talent is the Pac-12. The Pac-12's best team is not as good as Ohio State. It's not as good as Michigan, not as good as Georgia, not as good as Alabama, not as good as any of those teams.
But
But
it
as
fits
a
in the
conference,
mix.
the
Yeah,
top six is the best. They have
exactly.
it's Oregon, USC, Utah, Oregon State, UCLA, and Washington. Those six teams are top 25 teams. And none of them are the best team, but they're all very solid teams. And you look at the SEC, it has LSU, Alabama, Georgia. Top three teams. The rest of the teams are going to be average and lower. You look at the Big Ten, it's a three-team race with Ohio State, Penn State, and Michigan, and
And
no
they
one
all
else is
play.
relevant.
They all play in the Big Ten. What, East?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
wasn't it
they
Purdue
all
against
play in the
Michigan in the Big
yeah
Ten
they
championship,
they
and
all
Purdue
play
had
Big
like
Ten East,
4 losses?
and then they get to play Wisconsin in the conference championship game, and they win by 50. So
Yeah,
that's going to be a joke. And then you look at the ACC. It's literally this year. It's going to be Florida State, Clemson, and North Carolina. No one else is relevant. The Big 12 is just they're all just average. And then like Texas is always overhyped. They're not going to be as good. TCU had a good year last year. So I feel like now with these conferences, they're like much deeper, and it gives more competition. Now instead of Ohio State playing at Rutgers, they have to go to UCLA, to USC, to Oregon,
yeah,
to Washington. They're not winning all those games. As good as Ohio State is as a football program, they're not going to Oregon and winning every year. You don't
yeah.
win at Autzen Stadium. You don't win at all these Pac-12 schools. They have to fly 5 hours across. We saw this a few years ago. UCLA has been an average football program for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
LSU, who won the national championship, I know they weren't as good the next year. They go to UCLA, UCLA throttles them. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not always, yes, if UCLA went to LSU, we would get throttled. But if you have to come to the West Coast and come to these schools like Utah, Oregon, USC, you're not winning those games. So Michigan, it's going to be tougher for Michigan. It's going to be tougher for Ohio State in a good way. It's going to help them. And also for the recruiting, now there's no reason that's like CJ Stroud and Bryce Young were both from California, and they both went to Alabama and Ohio State. Why? Now instead they're still in the they can still go to premier programs like USC, Oregon, Washington, UCLA. They're all in the Big Ten. They're all in these big conferences. There's no reason for them to go move across the country to these big brands because they want to get more attention. Now the Pac-12 games will be at better times. The Pac-12 will be playing at noon, which will probably be like 3 Eastern time. So everyone around the country can watch the games.
Yep.
And they get to play against the premier competition. They get to play at Ohio State. They get to play at the Big House in Michigan. They get to play at Penn State, which is probably the best atmosphere in college football. They get to play at all these different places, and it's great for the branding. It's great for the money because they get paid more money, and it's just great for the athletes in general because they get to get their name out. They get to they're like all the like the Heisman. Caleb Williams won the Heisman last year, but the Pac-12 always has a tough time, even with their top players, getting them into the national spotlight unless they're just so extremely good because they play at 10 o'clock at night, which is literally everyone's sleeping on the East Coast. So I feel like it's a great thing that they're moving and just getting out of the Pac-12, which is just a terrible conference, terrible referees, no more Pac-12 referees. So
Bro, praise
thank
the Lord,
God, you don't
bro.
understand, bro. You don't
Oh
understand.
my
If you don't watch the
God.
Pac-12, you don't get it, bro. It makes you want to turn off the TV 5
It
minutes
makes you
into the game.
cringe. It literally makes you cringe sometimes.
Yeah,
It boils your blood.
Sometimes you just watch the game and you're just, even if your team is getting crushed, you just laugh because the referees are so abysmal. So we're done with the Pac-12 referees. We're done with the Pac-12's terrible money contracts. We're done with the terrible marketing by having us play at 11, 12 p.m. at night. Now we get to play with the big boys in these big conferences, and we get to just show everyone that the Pac-12 is the conference of champions, and we're going to get this done. The Big Ten is going to start winning championships in football, in basketball. I can guarantee you that in the next 10 years, there will be a college football champion from Oregon, Washington, USC, UCLA, somewhere in the Pac, someone on the West Coast or somewhere in the Big Ten, like Ohio State, Michigan. One of those teams is going to win. And then in basketball, UCLA, Oregon, all these teams, they're going to be big factors in college basketball now because they get to
Yeah.
play with the higher level competition, the recruiting,
Yeah.
the marketing. It's going to help a lot. People will be surprised. I think it's going to be a good shift for college basketball. But honestly, college sports change all the time, and there's no continuity. Like we look before, like the basics of college football stay the same, but like everything's changed. The BCS was 10 years ago. Now it's the college football playoff. Now we're expanding the college football playoff. It's just
As we
constant
should.
evolution with the system. The NCAA with NIL, everything's changing in that
It
sense.
was bound to change.
It
It
was
was
bound to
bound
change.
to
It
change.
needs to change because the system was
Yep.
just so stringent and like so hierarchical that it didn't
Yep.
work. You need to have
Absolutely.
you have to have an evolution just as society evolves. You need to have an evolution for college sports. So I feel like it's really good in that sense. But like I just don't know like I don't know, man. I don't know what's gonna happen in the future because
Yeah.
I at this point with all these big conferences, it's just like it's gonna get to the point where it's like, why are we having the conferences? And I never
Yeah.
am gonna
We should just
understand.
have one giant league that they all the good teams play. And again, adopting like a Premier League kind of system where you can have teams drop in and out of a Division 1 league, as it's so called. Like, yeah,
You know what would
it's a
be
thought.
sick? This would be sick. So I know that people are gonna say this is kind of what it was before, but we look at European football. We have
Yeah.
the Premier League, La Liga, the Bundesliga, Ligue 1, and we have like the Portuguese league. We have all these European leagues. They play in the Champions League.
Mhm.
Their top contenders play in the Champions League. And we look at the individual leagues, they all have their domestic title. So they have the Premier League title, La Liga title, all these at Serie A, all these different things, right?
Yeah.
College football was kind of like this in the sense that there was all the conferences. So like the Pac-12, you can compare it to like La Liga, and then the SEC was like the Premier League, and like all you get like that kind of thing, right? And then they would have the college football playoff, which is like the Champions League. But I feel like in that sense, the problem was that the Champions League is a long event. It goes the whole entire year. You play tons of different teams, and it's always like the top 3 or 4 teams from your league play
Yeah.
in the Champions League. In college football, the problem was that the same 4 teams would be competing from the same conferences, and not all conferences were involved. So
And
it's
it's always
basically
only
like
4 teams.
it's
Always
always
four
it's
teams.
basically like if the Premier League had their top 2 teams versus La Liga's top 2 teams every year, and
Yeah.
it was just dumb. So like now, what college football could strive to become is like we have these 3 major conferences right now, and then the ACC is kind of sitting there, and then there's the 4 Pac-12 teams that are left. So we basically have 3 major conferences and one side conference. You could have like the college football play is supposed to be expanding next year to 12 teams. Now it can become like that 12 teams means there's more games, more interconference playing. So I feel like you could have the conferences play each other. I don't screw the non-conference schedule. You could just play conference opponents. If you have like now it's good enough where you have so much good competition with like in the Big Ten, we're gonna have Oregon, Washington, UCLA, USC, Ohio State, Penn State, Wisconsin, Michigan. Those are 8 top brands in college football. You don't need to have a non-conference schedule. You could just play. You have 16 teams, 18 teams in the conference. You could just play
Each other.
11 games, conference
Yeah.
games. You have the SEC play 11 conference games. So Georgia gets to play Texas, Oklahoma, Alabama, LSU, because Georgia's not going undefeated with that schedule. They get to play all those teams. The Big
Yep.
12, same thing. You have those 3 conferences do that. And then you just take out non-conference play. You do that. And then you basically have the college football playoff, which is a 12-team thing. You have basically 4 teams from each of those main conferences, and then the ACC is included. So you could have like maybe 3 teams from most of them, and then like 1 or 2 teams from the ACC, and
Yeah.
you just do that, and then it's basically the Champions League.
Yep.
So I feel like that might be a good model that they might adopt. I don't know. They're probably going to keep non-conference games just because
Hmm.
the money they make, but I just feel like now with all these big conferences, the non-conference schedule is going to lose importance because they're all in the same conference. So you don't need to do all
Yeah.
these non-conference games. And I feel like they should really, because the football is the most widely watched sport in the world, and it's not even close. Like everyone loves football, and there's a variety of reasons for that. But one of the reasons is that it's a global sport. There's different nations play against each other. They have different leagues. It's played everywhere. I feel like college football needs to adopt that model. Even other professional sports leagues in America are trying to expand into different like people say the NBA wants to have a team in Mexico, the NFL wants to have a team in Europe. It's like everyone's trying to expand and globalize just because they get more influence, they get more viewership. So I feel
Hmm.
like for college football, it might be a good idea to just like really like look at that model because that's a successful model. And you don't have to have exactly what the Premier League and exactly what the Champions League have in the sense of domestic and then European competition. But I feel like they should definitely take good elements from that and try to replicate that in college football because college
Hmm.
football I feel like, in my opinion, has been dying over the last 10 years because the same teams, Alabama, Georgia, win every single year.
It's predictable.
And
It was
it's very
predictable for
predictable.
a
And it's
while.
for a team like I'm a UCLA fan, he's an Oregon fan. Oregon has been to a few national championships, but every year you know that if they lose one game at the end of the year, their season's over. So they could
Yeah.
have a great season, go 8-8, be 8-1, and then they lost to Arizona State and their season's over. And like UCLA, last year we had our best year in like the last decade. We were 8-1. We lose to Arizona before we play at USC. Our season's over. Like it's just once you lose two games in college football, your season's over. Now, when you have bigger conferences, teams are going to lose two games.
Yeah,
If
you're
you're
not going to have
playing
any
a,
more undefeated. And the
there's not
undefeated
gonna be
teams will actually earn it. It's not going to
exactly.
be these little cupcake schedules where you're
Yeah,
playing the Austin Pays or the
yeah,
rest of your conference that is just garbage. You're actually
yeah.
playing teams that deserve a spot to be playing you in the first place. And
Facts. Like
that is
when
what's going to set the tone.
yeah, like when Ohio State was going undefeated every single year and then they didn't win a playoff. It's like how can you possibly go like even Michigan, they went undefeated for 2 straight years in the regular season, and then or like basically close to that. They might have lost one game. They went undefeated basically. They go to the playoff and they lose in the semifinal both years. It's like at some point you need to have enough competition where you don't go undefeated. There's no reason that these teams should be going undefeated because they're not good enough to go undefeated. Like those Michigan teams the last 2 years
And
were
it's
not
so
good enough teams to
unpredictable
go
too.
undefeated.
It's so unpredictable college football games. Because I mean, like you look at
It
the
should
environment of
be.
college
It
football
should
games,
be.
like upsets are bound to
They should
happen as
happen.
well.
Exactly. So you need to feed into that. You can't just have because the whole reason that people like college sports, the only reason that people would watch a college sport more than a pro sport is because of the unpredictability. Because
Yeah.
the reason that they like it is just because they're college athletes. They're not as talented, but they have a bigger range of where they can go because they're younger, they're less experienced. They're not as steady. The NFL players are steady. The college football players are up one week, down the other week. So there's a lot more variation. So the reason it's so exciting is because you don't know who's going to win every week. You could
Yeah.
see Oregon would be ranked number one and then or like in the top five and they lose to Stanford. And then Stanford would be ranked in the top five, they lose to Oregon. And then Notre Dame would be terrible one year and they beat USC. And then USC would be terrible and they beat Notre Dame. It's just like it makes college football interesting because you don't know what's going to happen. But now the last
Yeah.
10 years, you know what's going to happen. Every week,
Mhm.
you can basically predict what's going to happen. And like there's a good chance you'll get most of it right. So I feel like it'll be good just to have these conferences playing together so that they're bigger conferences, there's higher levels of competition, and there's more unpredictability because that's what makes sports fun. The reason that people like to watch sports is because they don't know what's going to happen. If you know what's going to happen, you don't care because it's boring. There's no reason. You wouldn't bet on the game if you know what's going to happen. It's all boring. Okay. So the reason that all these things are fun, the betting, going to games, all this different stuff is because there's an element of unknown that you need to have, an unpredictability that you need to have.
Yeah. Yeah. And just a few things to close everything out. For starters, like this whole argument, like people are really trying to find like things that are like wrong with it. And the articles that I've been reading is like the distance, especially for these West Coast teams, that they're gonna have to travel in order to like get to their games. And it's like, okay, well, for starters, like the teams on the East Coast will also have to travel to the West Coast in order to play those games. And not only that, but if you're a really good college athlete, odds are you're gonna go to the NFL where every week, more often than not, you're in a different city, in a different state, in a different part of the country. Like you're basically just setting yourself up for what your career is. So there's that. And also, the whole point about, oh, well, the Pac-12 is going to be diminished. I genuinely don't think that. I think it's really time to start questioning these other conferences like the Sun Belt, like the Mountain West, like Conference USA, all of these very nonchalant, low tier conferences. I think those are the ones that have to go. And when you look at who's going to fill in the gaps for the Pac-12, I think you start questioning teams like UNLV, like Wyoming, Nevada, Boise State, Fresno State, San Diego State, San Jose State, all of these teams that you know about, but you don't really know what conference they play in, but you know that they're decent. You know that in in those first 3 weeks when you're not really playing anyone, those are the teams that you end up playing. And sometimes they get beat by those teams because those
Yeah.
teams show up and want to play and want to prove a point. So I think in negotiation to the whole argument of, well, what's next for the Pac-12? Does it just diminish itself? I think it's these lower lesser known conferences like the Sun Belt, like the Mountain West, teams like
Yeah.
where Liberty plays, and all these
Yeah, no, I
teams,
know.
like
Yeah.
I think it's time to really start questioning those conferences and have those teams fill up the spots of these conferences like the ACC and the
Wait,
Pac-12
but
that are going to diminish themselves.
that's interesting because that's also something we need to get into because now that the main brands in these big conferences are moving,
Yeah.
USC, UCLA, Oklahoma, Texas, all these teams are moving, right?
Yeah.
They're forming these big, strong conferences with massive brands. Okay.
Yes. Mhm.
Let's look at college football. Basketball is different, but let's look at football first. No team outside of those three, four conferences is going to ever make the playoff,
Yeah.
besides maybe Notre Dame, who's an independent, but they're a big brand. But like, you're never going to see now like Coastal Carolina make the playoff, but we saw Cincinnati make a playoff from the American Conference. That's not going to happen anymore. When you have these
Yeah.
big conferences with everyone playing each other, there's no reason to accept a team from like San Diego State. Like they're not going to make it. Like even if they
Mhm.
go undefeated and have a great year, they're not going to make it. So I feel like it's this conference realignment really hurts the small conferences because
Yeah.
now they have no chance of getting into the dance. They have no chance. They have no chance.
Exactly.
So what I feel like
Exactly.
what's going to happen is like honestly they might just have to create another division for those teams because first of all, there's no reason that Austin Pay should be playing Georgia. Like they're
Mhm.
not the same level of athlete. They're not the same level of player. I know that they're trying to grow. Like for example, it was a whole case with the HBCU where Dion was coaching at Jackson State.
Jackson
They're trying to
State. Yeah.
grow those schools by playing big schools like UCLA and like HBCU played UCLA. They play Alabama, Georgia. They play all these big schools because they want the marketing and they want to be able to grow their brand. But for the big schools, like I feel like this is going to really hurt the smaller schools because, like, why now, if you're a big school, besides having an easy game, why are you going to play those schools if you have a conference with just a bunch of stacked teams? Like,
Yeah.
first of all, the non-conference, there's no reason to have a non-conference anymore because you get to play all these good teams. And second of all, like why if you're a big school, there's no reason for you to play these small teams unless you're trying to promote them. And like you're not trying to promote them. These schools don't care. They want to promote themselves. So like I
Yeah.
just feel like these smaller conferences are going to get really hurt by this. I have no
Mhm.
idea what's going to happen with them. I don't know if they're going to just create another division of football where they have like the upper tier division one and then the lower tier division one because
Yeah.
like teams like Eastern Washington and Sacramento State and Hawaii and all these smaller schools that the
Western
Pac-12
Michigan,
Western Michigan, all these small Appalachian State,
Colorado
all these
State, Utah
Colorado,
State,
exactly, all these smaller schools that play these teams in the first few weeks of the
Idaho.
year. Yeah, all these teams. I just don't see like I don't see a spot for them now because now the big schools have less of an incentive to play them,
I
and
think
it's also gonna look bad for these teams if one conference like the Big Ten decides to like let's say I'm not saying this is gonna happen. This is just all hypothetical, but like let's say the Big Ten abandons non-conference and they just play 11 conference games and the SEC decides to maintain their view of playing non-conference games, and they play Austin Pay, Western Michigan, and some other crappy school. That's
hmm,
three. That really hurts your strength of schedule because if you're playing as your worst game at Iowa versus at home versus Austin Pay, like it's not even a comparison. So I don't know. Like there's no incentive. There's gonna if they decide to disband, if they decide to take away non-conference games, it's gonna really, really, really hurt the smaller schools. And I feel like honestly, they might just have to create another division of football, basically make the lower tier schools like a Division 2 school. You could have like the top 80 teams be in Division 1, and then like the next 80 or 60 to 80 teams be in Division 2. But
mhm,
in basketball, it's different because now the way the tournament works, it's 32 automatic qualifiers and then 32 other bids from the big conferences usually. Now, if they have these big conferences, why do this like are the small schools still going to get all the same amount of bids even though you have big school like it's just
mhm.
it's kind of weird like I don't exactly know what's going to happen from that standpoint.
I think when you I think now these smaller conference schools, they need to take advantage of this as quickly as possible before the college sports aspect changes too much. Because you look at the Pac-12 across the board on all sports. I mean, you look at back when they were the Pac-8, it was like USC for college football. And I can't really think of another school other than UCLA for like college basketball. And those were primarily the two dominant sports and have been the two
Yeah.
dominant sports throughout the decades. But you look at how small the Pac-12 was when it started off as the Pac-8, then slowly became the Pac-10, and now being the Pac-12 disintegrating to the Pac-4, whatever you want to call it. They still started off at a low point. And I
Yeah.
feel like that low point is exactly where these small conference schools are. And I feel like a good way for them to grow, not only in popularity, but in revenue as well, is to join a conference like the Pac-12 that has already made a name for itself and is now looking for teams to replace the team. Because obviously, like the people in the high offices of the Pac-12 are obviously going to want to prove a point, and they just want the point made of, oh, we weren't the problem, when a
They
lot
were
of
the
us,
problem.
a lot of us in the Pac-12 definitely feel like that, but they're going to try and prove otherwise.
Maybe.
And the best way for them to do that is to have these smaller Mountain West Sun
Yeah.
Belt conference teams fill up those
Yeah.
gaps in the Pac-12 and build up their brand once again, whether they do it a different way or the same way, and have them play to a higher expectation than they were
Yeah.
in the conferences that they were. Because obviously they're not getting as much televised popularity playing in the conferences. Like, I never go out of my way to watch a Mountain West game ever. Never go out of
Facts.
my way to
Yeah.
watch, like, but
That's the thing.
now with like the Pac-12 title behind their name and a network that a lot of people watch as it is, whether they
And not as
support
much
a
as they
team
could.
in the Pac-12. Yeah, exactly. But the
Yeah.
thing is that I feel like they definitely need this popularity as quickly as possible before the teams like Michigan, Oregon, USC, UCLA, Oklahoma, Texas, before they just take a complete grasp of college athletics and
Yeah.
crown themselves.
Well, I
Because
feel
I
like,
feel like these
yeah,
these underdog teams, they still have a shot in that. And like you say, in college basketball, like you
that's
look
the
at
thing.
San Diego State, who were a 5 seed in March
They
Madness
made,
this
yeah, no,
year.
no, that's what I'm trying to say. I feel like for football, it's over. For
Yeah.
football, all the big brands are gone. Like the Pac-12, those four teams are never going to be able to compete in the national landscape of college football. So just end that thought. You're not going to be able to compete with college football. You're not going to make as much revenue. End of
Okay.
story. Now
Okay.
what they need to do is these schools like Oregon State, Stanford, Cal, and Washington State, they should look to, like, honestly, let's basketball is the second highest revenue sport. Gonzaga is in the WCC. San Diego
Yep.
State is a very good basketball team. They're in the Mountain West Conference. The Mountain West is a solid basketball conference.
Yeah.
You could have a West Coast Conference, not like the one that it is now, but you could have a West Coast Conference which has Gonzaga, San Diego State,
Yeah.
Stanford, Cal, Oregon State, Washington State, and then fill it in with good, solid teams like that are in the Mountain West. Like Nevada is sometimes good, and then
Yeah.
I don't know who, like Colorado State has had a few good years. Wyoming
Mhm.
has had a good few years. Just have a solid basketball conference, and like that would be a decent conference. Like it wouldn't be a good conference, it wouldn't be a great
Yeah.
conference, but it would be solid. It would be
And
you
I
have
feel like,
Gonzaga is one of the best teams. San Diego State made a
yeah.
Final Four. Like you have good teams. It would
Mhm.
be good enough. It would be good enough. It would
I
be
feel
good
like
enough.
the quantity would be
Yeah,
what makes. I feel like if you take the Pac-12, the Mountain West, and the Western Conference, and you combine them into one giant just West Conference with all of those teams, I feel like the quantity of it will speak volumes, and just the
yeah,
variations in teams that you play. All because like there are a lot of teams on the West Coast that people have
yeah.
never heard
No
of
idea about.
or
Yeah,
don't care about. And
yeah.
so I feel like if, now that we're given an opportunity where the Pac-12 has basically disbanded itself, I feel like if we combine all of these conferences together into just one giant West conference, I feel like, and especially in a college basketball aspect, but it would be interesting to see in a college football aspect and see how they do. And I feel like that is
Probably
really
all
the
the problem is
only
all
way
comes
they
down to
go about
money.
it.
The problem is it all comes down to money because in
Well,
basketball, Gonzaga's not good in basketball. San Diego State is decent about in foot. Or no, Gonzaga's not good in
Gonzaga's good in
football.
basketball, but yeah,
Gonzaga's good in basketball, not good at football.
yeah,
They have a decent baseball program, but it's like the problem is that Gonzaga is not good at football. San
yeah,
Diego State is mediocre at football. A lot of these Mountain West schools are mediocre at football. I mean, Fresno State had a decent year, but like a lot of them are mediocre. And the problem is that they're not gonna. How are you gonna split the revenue? First of all, they're not gonna make a lot of revenue from football because a lot of those brands are not good in football. And
yeah,
then second of all, like how are you gonna split it? Because you're not gonna pay Portland, who's in the WCC, the same amount as you pay like Fresno State and
Yeah.
San Diego State, who are like probably the better college football programs in that region. It's just like that's the problem with it all. It's like these smaller schools are just gonna get hurt. Like the small schools. When I'm talking about small schools, I mean like Portland and like LMU and like these like teams.
What conference is Xavier in?
They're all in the big. Well, Xavier, they're in the Big East, I think.
That's Big East, right?
Yeah, because I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I think they're in the Big East. I think Xavier's in the big. Yeah, they're in the Big East with Villanova. See, that's the thing. Also, they need to have some. I feel like that's what they need to do. They need to have like the Big East is terrible in football. I don't even think half those schools play football, but they have a basketball conference. It's a strong basketball conference, just because the history that they had there. All these schools like UConn was big in the Big East. They had the whole bit the old Big East, and they split up, but they still have big brands there. They have Villanova, UConn, Xavier. Like they have all
Mhm.
these big teams. So I feel like what the West Coast should do is they should do a similar thing. They need to give up on football. They're not going to make as much money in football. They have to focus all their energy on basketball. And if you have a conference with St. Mary's, Gonzaga, San Diego State, you have Cal, Washington State, Oregon State, and
Stanford.
Stanford. You have some of the other strong Mountain West schools you have like New Mexico and then like Nevada, UNLV.
UNLV's women's team.
You have a decent conference. You have a decent conference. Some of these schools are good schools in basketball. I mean, there's always, and also it might impact the recruiting because it maybe kids want to stay on the West Coast. They decide to go there. I don't know. Like who knows? But they need to do something quick, because if they don't do something quick, then they're screwed. But there's potential to make a solid West Coast conference that's consisting of some big teams, but they just need to get it done. Because like you look at the Big 12. The Big 12 lost their two biggest brands. They added in Colorado, who's decent. Arizona State, decent. Arizona has a good basketball program, but their football team decent. Their Utah has a good football program, but their basketball is like mid. Then they added BYU, decent athletics. UCF, solid football program, but it's like mid. They added Houston, who has a good basketball program. Their football team's mid. And then they added, who's the fourth team? Cincinnati. Cincinnati has like solid basketball. Usually, recently they haven't been. And then their football had a good stretch, but they're not great. So it's like it's not like the Big 12 added some great teams. They just added a lot of solid teams. If the West Coast did the same thing, they had solid teams. They're not going to be as big as the main conferences, and that's okay. But they can have potentially room for growth, and maybe they'll eventually one day reach that. But I feel like that's the only option for them, because the current Pac-12, I feel like it's just going to have to disband, and then those teams can form like the next Pac-12, which will just be like a Pacific or a West Coast conference.
Yeah.
But there's no easy solution for these teams because they waited too long. And it's funny to me because I feel like when one of the statements, they would be like Cal would release a statement, they're like, "Oh, we're gonna try to get ahead of this." I'm like, "You're already behind, bro. Like you did not get ahead of this. You let everyone else do what they wanted to do, and now you're stuck in a bad position because you didn't take action. You weren't proactive about it. Now they're in a bad situation. They have to make the best of it. I feel like the best option for them, honestly, would just to be make a massive super West Coast conference and hope for the best and try to find a way to market it well, play games not at 10 p.m. and 9 p.m. Pacific time, play games at like 5 p.m. at the latest. And then people on the East Coast can actually watch your games and actually see your best players play and see the star athletes play. So I feel like that would be very important. Have someone that's really good with marketing head that group, because it has potential. Some of these schools are big schools, so they're not as big, but they have potential. So I feel like that's the only course of action for them, in my opinion. I mean, I'm not saying I know everything about this, but I feel like they're kind of stuck right now. They're kind of screwed, but they have to make the best of it.
Yep. Only time will tell. And, again, like this whole like college conference transferring, whatever you want to call it, like is mainly brought up because of the football programs there. So, when basketball season rolls around in essentially 2024 to 25, we'll see how that plays out. But, I say that the solution is the Pac-20. Just have Mountain West just come to the Pac-12, have, a couple of
Gonzaga,
other
St.
teams that are,
Mary's,
yeah.
yeah,
We'll see what happens. We can
yeah,
sit here and talk, debate, whatever
yeah.
for
But we'll
hours,
see what
but
happens. Yeah,
time will tell. Make sure to follow us on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter at Does Only Sport, and make sure to keep watching the full episodes on YouTube and on Spotify. This is gonna do it for episode 39. talking about the college football. This is only the beginning of it all. You know, we haven't even gone into any games yet. So that's definitely come. Also, we're talking about merch, which is in the process. So we'll keep you guys updated on that. Hopefully we have that released really soon. But yeah, that's gonna do it for us.
Potential game day vlogs,
Potential,
potential.
also potential game day vlogs. We're out in LA. Dylan goes to UCLA. I'm at community college, like we've said before. So we like to hang out at the UCLA games, and we might catch a few. Record the experience. We like to think that we're pretty funny guys.
We'll see.
We'll
That's up to you
we'll
guys.
see what happens, but yeah, stay tuned for all of that. Again, make sure you're following, make sure you like, comment, whatever, so that you're up to date with all of our information and all of our just things that we're doing, things that we're talking about. And yeah, we'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.